So I've promised our panelists, and I promise you that I won't let Ukraine eat the subject of our entire discussion, as it ate many of our discussions yesterday, but it is important and on all of our minds, so I want to begin there. And I'd like to begin with Norbert Röttgen and ask him a question that I've heard posed so many times. It's obviously a crucial strategic issue, and that is, how dependent is Germany today on Russian exports of energy? Can that dependency be reduced over the next year and over the next few years after that? And how should the world think of Germany as a player in this period in which Russia is being sanctioned, and there's every likelihood that Russia will respond with sanctions of its own?
Okay, thank you for this first question. I would beg to make three one-sentence remarks which are relevant for energy policy even when we are facing a current crisis. So the first sentence is, energy policy, even when we are facing current crisis, is by nature long-term, future-oriented policy. It's not short-term reaction, but long-term policy in any case. So it requires, second sentence, a notion of what the future requires if we want to shape the future. I'm deeply convinced that the future has to be low carbon, and that the political challenge is to achieve this goal as far as it is possible, while remaining or regaining economic competitiveness. So I think it is not the choice between either or, but we have to achieve both of the goals. Third sentence, as an introductory remark, is I'm convinced that Europe, and Germany especially, will not win the race to the bottom, but we can win the race about leadership in technology, in innovation, in green and efficiency technologies. These three pillars are the elements of German and European energy policy. What does this mean for the current crisis? To answer in figures, Russian gas is responsible for around about 1/3 of German gas supply. The export of natural resources are 80% of Russian exports. Energy exports contribute more than 50% to the Russian public budget. So you can call this dependency of Germany, but I think the more realistic picture is this is a description of interdependency. And this is one fundamental difference between the confrontation we are facing now to the historical experience of Cold War. There we had the world divided into military, political, and economic blocks. Now we have globalization, and we have interconnectivity and interdependency. So this is a different fact and a different basis for this confrontation. In Germany, we made the historical experience, even in the coldest times of Cold War, that there was no doubt about the reliability of Russian gas supply. And this is for good reason, because Russia is more dependent on sailing gas than we are dependent on buying gas. So I think Russia has the most important interest, is highly interested, not to allow its reliability as a gas supplier to come into doubt. And for this, there is this interdependency, but I think it will not be deployed as a weapon in the current crisis. And perhaps last remark, in any case, apart from this statement, Germany and Europe should be urgent in a strategy which includes diversification of gas supply. Our energy shift means to reduce the dependency on import of energy resources. We import 75% of our energy resources. We have to decrease this share. Developing green technologies means to reduce this dependency. We have to deploy and have to accelerate LNG harbor, and so we have to diversify our gas supply.
So if I understand you, you're saying that in this crisis, you think Germany should basically stick to the sound long-term policies, in your view, that it's adopted already. And I don't hear you calling for any special, urgent crisis move on energy that would respond to the situation. Am I hearing that right?
I would say to accelerate the decrease of dependency on imports. I would say to really evolve a European common energy market to improve our grids in order to get more interconnected in Europe. And I would say to intensify the research in storage and technology to become more competitive while not giving up the long-term goal of getting low carbon, because low carbon is not only a responsibility, but it is the basis for competition in the future.
Carlos, Pascual, I want to ask you first whether you think Norbert Röttgen is right in thinking that there's an underlying stability in Russia's need for energy revenues corresponding to Germany's need for energy imports. Is that a sensible analysis, do you think? And then secondly, and as importantly, what can the United States do in this crisis, which we've been saying now for 2 days, really changes the paradigm of the world in which we've been living, at least in foreign policy terms? What can the United States do to help Ukraine specifically, but also to help our European allies have greater energy security and stability going forward?
Great. Well, first of all, I'm not going to create a crisis in German-U.S. relations here. I think there's a very solid base in what Norbert laid out. But I think one of the critical experiences that we've seen throughout Europe is that competition is absolutely fundamental to creating a situation where a country cannot and should not use its energy resources to coerce other countries to take political actions or measures. And that should be something that we have to be, and fundamentally have to be able to address in our global economic policies and international security policies. One of the things I would underscore about Germany and Europe is the degree of change that has occurred in this market over the last 5 years. So let's just take a second on this, because compared to the year 2009, during the Russia-Ukraine energy disputes, when Russia shut off supplies to Ukraine, you saw downstream impacts all the way throughout Europe. And why is it that we're not having the same nature of discussion today? And a fundamental reason is the change in policies that have occurred in the European market. Through the leadership of the European Commission and the countries that have been involved, there have been a radical change of policies that have created anti-monopoly measures so that you cannot own the gas, own the pipelines, and own the distribution systems. Simple mechanisms like the elimination of destination clauses, so that now when Germany buys that gas from Russia, when it gets to Germany, they own it. And if Germany wants to trade it, it can trade it. If it wants to send it to Ukraine, it can send it to Ukraine. There has been a program to build infrastructure so that you now have the ability to move gas west to east, north to south, south to north, so that it's possible for a country like Slovakia to buy gas from Norway, to have it delivered to Germany, and the Russian supplies that are coming through the Nord Stream pipeline entering Germany on the other side can actually be swapped through, sent back to the Czech Republic, to Slovakia, and amazingly enough, those supplies with some policy changes could actually end up in a country like Ukraine. The other piece that has been phenomenally different over time is that the United States, and this comes to your point about shale gas, the United States has produced a huge amount of gas. our gas production has increased 35% over the last 5 years, largely because of shale. As a result of that, the United States is not importing LNG. At this stage, we were expected to be importing about 80 billion cubic meters of gas a year. We import 5 from Canada. The result of that has been a redistribution of gas supplies in different parts of the world, from Qatar, Trinidad and Tobago, Nigeria. And one of the places that that gas largely came to in 2012 was Europe. And as a result of the gas, the changes in policies, the infrastructure, the ability to trade, in 2012, Statoil sold more gas in the European market than Gazprom did, and every single one of the 21 major Western European utilities renegotiated their contracts with Gazprom to reduce the price and extend the financing terms. Okay, that is a market power that's created by competition. It's also reflective of what the supplies of American gas, not even being exported, but the fact that there was more supply in a global market. So since then, the United States has approved 6 export licenses for gas. If all of those contracts or licenses come into complete fruition, by the year 2017 to 2019, it will mean that the United States is exporting another 89 billion cubic meters of gas. In addition to that, there's more gas that's coming from Norway, from the Mediterranean, from Australia. Mozambique has had the largest gas finds in the world. Just say then one last thing to come back to the part of Ukraine. Ukraine needs help today with the issue of diversification. They have been fundamentally dependent on gas from Russia. They have produced out of a total consumption of 50 billion cubic meters a year. They've produced about 20. They've imported on the scale of about 25 from Russia, and they've made up the difference with some minor imports from other parts of the world. This is a critical time, first of all, to be able to help Ukraine import gas from the West. Poland and Hungary already have pipeline interconnections that can be utilized. They're small, but they're symbolic. Ukraine has the possibility to work out with Slovakia an pipeline interconnection that, depending on how it is handled, can handle between 7 to 15 billion cubic meters of gas.
How quickly can that be done, Carlos?
The 7 billion cubic meters, which is a physical interconnection, no reason why it could not be completed by the end of this year. And indeed, next week, the European Commission is hosting the principal parties from Slovakia and Ukraine to get into the technical details. I was in Ukraine the past 3 days and had a chance to discuss it with Minister Prodan. The Ukrainian side is very willing to do it. This is something with the right political will and the willingness to finance what is actually a very small amount, $20 million, principally for meters, could actually be operational by November.
So that's something specific and short-term that we should expect will happen, that pipeline interconnection providing some additional supplies to Ukraine by year-end.
Very definitely one of the things that can be done. But let me stress another point. To work out all of these issues, it is, I think, critical that Russia recognize what Norbert has said, that Russian supply to the European market and to its neighbors, and to be seen as a reliable supplier, is important for Russia and it's important for Europe. Because in the end, even if it's 30% dependency, taking 30% off a market is bad for Europe.
Yes,
it's going to drive prices up. And frankly, it's bad for Russia. So look at this perspective. Russia has pipelines connecting it with Europe for about 140 billion cubic meters. The fastest growing gas market in the world is Asia. And Russia has the capacity to export 14 billion cubic meters. Russia is totally dependent on this market for its revenue from gas exports.
I want to ask you one last question. If imagining the Secretary of State of the United States in this crisis, and he has a prominent official who's his energy policy coordinator, given the nature of crises in America, I can't imagine but that Secretary Kerry didn't summon Carlos Pascual and say, what can we do? What's our policy for this crisis? What are the 5 things that we can work on right now? And although you talked specifically about this pipeline connection, I'm not hearing that kind of, what are we going to do now to help Ukraine and our allies in Europe get through this? And if there's more to say, I think we'd all be interested.
There are a number of things to say, and that's part of what we were working through when I was in Ukraine over the past week, why we've been so engaged with the European Commission, why we've been working so closely with a whole range of different companies to understand what the private sector can do and what the financial requirements are. I think one of the things that's important to do is go back to what Norbert said at the beginning. To have a strategy, you need to know where you're going and what the long-term solution is, because otherwise you're building bridges to nowhere. And so the bridge to somewhere in Ukraine is to recognize that, first of all, that 20 billion cubic meters a year that they've been producing has been consistent since Soviet times. They're using 1970s technology. If they invite private participation, investments, and engagement, they can quickly and quite readily increase that production by 30%. So one of the first things that we discussed is, what is it going to take to set up the projects that are necessary to invite private participation? Secondly, there are projects and contracts that were signed last year that could, by the year 2020, bring Ukraine another 20 billion cubic meters of gas. Those are contracts that have been signed with Chevron, with Shell, with Eni. And if you bring those two together, 20, 23, 25 billion cubic meters, another 20, you start putting in place energy efficiency measures, you put in place these reverse flow measures, Ukraine could find itself realistically by the year 2020 in a situation where it becomes its choice on whether or not it wants to import gas from Russia. And if you understand that as a starting point, then you have the potential to go back and say, okay, these bridges make sense. The interconnections with Poland, reactivating that. The interconnections with Hungary, reactivating that. And so that's part of what we've been talking about, how to put them back in place. The interconnection with Slovakia, putting that in place. Who's going to provide the gas? Because in the end, someone has to sell it. There is not, surprisingly, an interest on the part of sellers of gas to have guarantees for those purchases. How can they work? How does this get integrated with an IMF program? How does that interrelate with implications and expectations about pricing? So all of these things are issues that we have to work out in the short term. And here's the final point. Ukraine is buying gas from Russia. And it's important for us to work with that and encourage it to be a stable and transparent relationship, because what is critical here is to have that gas flow on commercial terms and be extracted from the political equation.
Okay, I think the Secretary just sort of said, okay, I have a 5-point policy. Thank you. Seiji, Kihara, first I should just note that one of the interesting consequences of this Ukraine crisis is that your Prime Minister Abe, who'd been involved in this interesting diplomatic opening with Vladimir Putin, had gone to Sochi. The world was watching the Abe-Putin relationship. Immediately when the crisis began, pulled back toward traditional allies, the United States and Europe, and pulled back from Putin. That was a striking development. I just want to ask you, from your perspective in Japan, an energy needy, energy stressed country in some ways. Yep. How do you look at this kind of energy turmoil in European markets, the response to it? What's that going to mean for Japan and by extension for other Asian importers?
Right. First of all, I would like to make it very clear that Ukraine's situation is of great concern not only to the Europe and the United States, but also to Asia and Japan as well. As David correctly pointed out, Japan has a scarce energy resource, and our energy self-sufficiency is only below 4%. So we depend almost all energy outside Japan. So any kind of turmoil in the energy market is a quite bad effect on Japan at the moment, especially in the current Japanese situation is we have no nuclear power at the moment. And 90% of our energy comes from the fossil fuel. So it's very important to have a very stable market, and we have to work very hard on this. And I would like to add one more thing is, not only on the perspective from economy or energy point of view, but it's very important here is the geopolitical point of view. As you know, in Asia, tension still remains. We have a country increasing their military expense by double digit for nearly 2 decades. So how to deal with the Ukrainian issue had a great impact on the Asian geopolitical issue as well. So these are the two reasons why Japan is so concerned on this Ukrainian issue. And one more thing I would like to add is in Asia, we don't have the same kind of pipeline network as in Europe. So this is another factor we have been very worrying about.
Jean-Pierre Clamadieu, I said at the outset, energy is a political commodity as well as an economic commodity. You have to deal with the economic commodity. What do you think the implications will be for companies like yours and other buyers of electricity, buyers of energy-related supplies in the aftermath of what we're seeing now?
Well, maybe a few explanations on why I'm here. I'm the CEO of a large chemical company with a large user of energy and a large user of natural gas, which is also for us raw material. What we've seen in the past 5 years is not a nice transition. We've seen a revolution in terms of energy. Very impressive success story in the US with the development of shale gas and a lot of challenges in Europe. My colleague from BP has described it in a very diplomatic words. The reality is that today the energy landscape in Europe is not a pretty one. And I think we'll come back to this in the remaining part of this discussion. On the Ukrainian crisis, I think the situation seen from the large energy users in Europe is very simple. We need in Europe more gas in our energy mix and more competitive gas. Knowing, it's probably worth reminding to some of the members of the audience that today natural gas prices in Europe is 3 to 4 times what it is in the US. So we need more and more competitive. Today, it's coming largely from Russia. 30% of our energy, of our gas supply in Europe is coming from Russia, more or less the same number as in Germany. And currently, Russia share is slightly increasing, and Russia is willing, Gazprom, both a commercial company but also a political arm of the Russian government, is ready to be a little bit more accommodating in terms of prices. So short term, very short term, we are very lucky because this crisis is happening at the end of a mild winter. Storage are very high. We can do what we want. There is no issue short term. Medium term, I would say in the next couple of years, we don't have that much flexibility, or to say that differently, flexibility will have a price. And if we decide to go for other sources, this will have an impact on the price of gas for household and for large industrial users. Longer term, there are not that many potential game changers. One of them is LNG export from the US, but it will take time. I mean, to build the liquefaction or gasification units, it takes 3-4 years if you expect the permitting to be quick, which might not be the case. We could also look at developing our own European resources, shale gas, but it will take a long time. You know we know how the public opinion is reacting to shale gas in Europe, and even if the political decision makers are ready to move on, I think we won't see the same success as what we've seen in the US. So I think we have some flexibility, but limited and with cost associated with it in the current crisis.
So I want to move the camera back now from the immediate Ukraine crisis to the larger issues of energy policy. And I'd like to start again with Norbert Röttgen and ask you to speak about what you began to describe, which is Germany's commitment to clean energy, to renewable energy. But I want to push you a little bit on the question that I'm sure Jean-Pierre and other people in the market would, which is at what economic cost is this strategy of clean energy being purchased? And are you pushing Europe for sensible political reasons or understandable political reasons into a more and more difficult economic situation where European competitiveness begins to be at risk?
Of course, prices count for competitiveness. But I would say Germany did not so bad deciding for the energy shift and remaining competitive. And your question gives me the opportunity to deliver the facts about the prices. The fact is that the consumers are paying the price, not the industry in Germany. The industry has this energy shift is called, the name is energy shift, but it is reduced to electricity. So we have to have a view on the electricity prices in Germany. And the electricity prices for the industry has decreased after Fukushima. We have lower electricity prices because the price level in the stock exchange has plunged from about 70 euros per megawatt hour to lower than 40, I would say about 35 euros per megawatt hour, because we have such a supply and offer of electricity. So the stock exchange level has decreased, and the political decision in Germany is a little bit challenged by the European Commission to make an exclusion for the industry. The industry is not burdened with the financing of these investments. They are not burdened in order to make this shift and to remain economically, industrially competitive. So we have consumer costs, so we have social costs, and by this we have political costs, because we have to justify why are the consumers held to pay more for electricity. We have still remained a broad support for this. We have, of course, a public debate about it. It played a role in the last parliamentary election. We will have a relaunch or a new bill of the so-called Renewable Energy Act. So this means we will adjust. The costs of subsidizing green technologies have also decreased. We have now photovoltaic for about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Windmills onshore are about 7 or 8 cents per kilowatt hour. So we have an increase in productivity, we have a decrease in costs, and you have to manage this transformational process. This is a challenging, of course, but we want to exclude the industry from this, and we are struggling with the EU Commission. If the EU Commission allows Germany to pursue the energy shift by remaining economically competitive, and I would say a coherent EU Commission policy would require Germany to allow it to remain economically competitive.
I should ask Jean-Pierre Clamadieu, who has to live in the marketplace with these rules, whether he feels to evaluate what Norbert just said.
Oh, I mean, Norbert obviously is absolutely right, but the situation is very complex. We have to, but it's really having an impact. First, I will come back to what's happening, but it's having an impact because for energy-intensive industries, we are today reallocating assets. Us, BASF, Bayer, the steel industry, the glass industry, we are seeing today capital investments being reallocated from Europe to North America or to Asia. So what's happening is very different in gas and electricity. In gas, the issue is Europe versus the US. And again, we've seen a situation where, and no one, I think, 5 years ago, even in a seminar like this one, would have forecasted such a breakthrough.
Due to shale gas.
Yes. On gas, US today is a very, very competitive country.
Yep.
And we are seeing our colleagues in the chemical industry investing hundreds of billions of dollars to develop crackers and transformation units. And soon we'll see plastics, to use the simple words, flowing from North America into Europe and competing with our own export in Asia. Regarding electricity, we have a very fragmented European landscape. There is nothing like an EU energy policy. And this is something which is missing. We are seeing Germany moving its way, very strong focus on renewable, but a clear political decision to insulate industries from the cost of this investment in renewables. This is not at all the case in France, in Belgium, or in Spain. When I look at how much I pay for electricity, I'm a very large user of electricity in Europe, I have 30% differences between Germany, with a low cost today with Italy, and France or Belgium. And the difference is not so much the price of the electron, what I pay to the utilities, it's taxes or transportation cost. And this situation, I think, is detrimental for European industry. We need to develop a real European energy policy, and we are far from this. Europe has a very clear climate change policy with a European-wide tool, ETS, with its strengths and weaknesses. But as far as energy is concerned, I think we are just at a point where policymakers, Mr. Barroso, the head of state, are starting to realize that we have an issue. And this was part of a framework that the Commission has issued, has published a few weeks ago. But in terms of actual action plans, very, very limited. And I think that for industry, this is a big issue. We need to develop a European energy policy. Yes, we need to move towards renewable, no question. Something which is certainly a bit more difficult to address is the role that nuclear should play. And we've seen very different decisions in very different countries. Germany moving very quickly out of nuclear. By the way, with limited discussion with its neighbors on this issue. We've seen Belgium moving out more slowly of nuclear. We've seen France asking the question, but probably at the end of the day, we won't see much of a change. But we need to have a common answer on how we see nuclear playing its role. And the next question brings us back to our previous discussion on gas. What role do we want gas to play in the European energy policy? What we've seen in the past year, which is really, I think, a shock and probably not something which goes in the right direction, is coal. Cheap coal coming from the US because the US went from gas to coal. Cheap coal being imported into Europe, replacing gas at a cost of more CO2 emission. Germany is one of the few developed countries which has seen CO2 emission moving up in the last 12 months.
I think this is a good moment to come to Carlos Pascual. I'll come back to Mr. Kihara in a minute about the nuclear issue for Japan. But Carlos, give us your best summary of what you see as the shale oil and gas revolution in the U.S. and its consequences for the world of the State Department, the world of foreign policy. We hear a lot of loose talk about how everything's different. The people throw these numbers around. From your perspective, what is the transformation going on as a result of these very substantial finds of shale oil and gas in the U.S.?
Sure. I think you have to separate out the markets between oil and gas. The increases in both have been phenomenal. The United States has increased its oil production by about 30% in the last 5 years. It increased by 1 million barrels a day in 2012, another 1 million barrels a day in 2013, on track for another 1 million barrels a day 2014. So in 3 years, the United States will have created the functional equivalent of a UAE, Kuwait, equivalent to what Iraq is exporting today. And the principal supplier of that oil has come from the state of North Dakota. And it really has been as a result of the developments in innovation in technology that has allowed the development of shale oil resources. And part of that development of technology goes back to exactly what you said before, of having the price environment and the entrepreneurial environment to reward it and allow it to grow. One thing I want to say is that both on oil and gas, how you do it and the environmental protections that you take is absolutely key. And we had to learn lessons in the United States, and we are doing everything that we can to share them with other countries. The European Commission, we've worked with the IAEA to help set up a repository of information. We've had exchanges with countries ranging from Poland to China to Ukraine to Chile, really throughout the world to try to be able to extend some of the best practices and lessons, and that's key to what we're doing. So the first thing that comes up regarding oil is, as a result of this increase in production, our imports of oil have gone from 60% of consumption in 2005 to about 35%. And so the question is, why do we care about the rest of the world? Do we care about the Middle East? Do we care about peace and security? And the answer is absolutely, you bet. Because while we have changed the security of supply and put the United States in a position of greater ability to access resources to support our economy, oil is a global commodity with a global price. And when there's instability and insecurity anywhere in the world, we pay it here in Europe, we pay it in the United States, and we have a fundamental concern about this. And so the United States, yes, for many reasons, is going to stay engaged and involved in the Middle East, but we're going to do it as well for our own economic interests. We're going to stay engaged in the security of transit lanes because it's in our own economic interest. But I think the other part of the oil market that is even more critical than what the United States is producing, I go back to one of the things Ian said, is the majority of the growth and consumption is in the non-OECD countries. If you look out in the future, all of our countries are absolutely flat or declining. And absolutely all of the growth is in the non-OECD countries. China, India, Brazil, countries in the Middle East. And the question that arises is that, number one, if you look at a country like China, and you think about its position in the market, it potentially in the future is the price pull factor on global prices. So did we think we would be in a room where we would be saying that China's ability to satisfy its demand for oil is fundamentally critical to every single one of us because it's going to affect the prices that you're going to pay in Europe and we're going to pay in the United States? It is now. And related to that is another question, which is, who's going to create the rules of governance in this world? Because the principal governance agency is the International Energy Agency. It was created after the 1972 crisis on oil. The purpose of it was to try to figure out how to have emergency responses in the oil world. And my God, the majority of the countries that are consuming are outside of the OECD. So how do we work with them? And this is one of the critical challenges that we're facing right now on how to reach out to those countries. So, can I just say one thing on gas?
Yes, and then I want to go to one of our word clouds.
All right. I just want to go on to gas for 1 second, because we talked a little bit about gas in the European market and how much it's changed. The fastest growing market for gas in the world is Asia. And there's a reason why Asia is paying $15 to $20 per million BTU for LNG, and Europe is paying about 10. The United States right now is paying 4.5. Part of it's supply, but the other part of it is that the market infrastructure in Asia is so thin. They have not made the investments yet in regasification infrastructure and storage and pipelines and vessels. There's still a need for the elaboration of the regulatory policies that ensure competition within that market. There are a few links between the market and the financial world so that you can get financial intermediation. And the data that's necessary to make the market function is still very thin. And so one of the biggest issues on the geopolitics of gas in the future may seem pretty boring, but it's going to be what happens in Asia to build that market infrastructure, to create a competitive market, and to begin to be able to create the kind of environment where gas can compete with coal, so that the fastest growing coal market in the world might have, which is Asia, might have the beginnings of a possibility to bend that demand curve for coal.
So I do want to use this little bit of technology, and if our Brussels Connect people could put up the word cloud. The question is, in 15 seconds, please, what words come to mind when thinking of the U.S. shale gas boom? And you can't use words that you wouldn't use on television. Plastics. Well, awesome. There's a word that you couldn't say is underused for any subject.
Lucky.
Lucky. I think lucky is... So I'm going to note opportunity and independence as the two most interesting words there. And I'm sure they're both absolutely right. I have one more question for our panel, and then we're going to go to the audience, so please be thinking of your questions. And the last question is to Mr. Kihara. After Fukushima, this terrible nightmare that Japan suffered with, Japan is in a fascinating and painful dilemma. You can't live with nuclear, you can't live without nuclear. You've stopped it, but there are many people who say it's just crazy not to resume nuclear power production. And I'd be very interested what you, as somebody looking at both the market and public policy sides of this, would share with this audience about where nuclear energy goes in the future in Japan.
Yeah, as I told you, currently we don't have any nuclear power plant in work. What's happening is the electricity cost price increase by, on average, by 20 to 25%, and it is a huge toll on business, especially for small and medium-sized companies. It is a huge increase of electricity price. So, in the short term, we have to resume our nuclear power according to the stricter safety standard set by the new regulatory authority. We cannot afford without the nuclear power as a baseload energy at the moment. But in the mid to long term, at the same time, it seems to me very difficult to make new or to construct new nuclear power plant in Japan. I don't think we can get the approval or the consensus from the Japanese public after such kind of big accident. So what we are going to do is to fill the gap by increasing the renewable energy, but I think it takes a long time. So for the time being, we have to do very much work on what Carlos says to improve the market mechanism on the gas or the coal, particularly on gas. As you really correctly pointed out, we have no market mechanism in Asia, so we have to have a kind of virtual market mechanism on gas as well in this regard. And one more thing is technical innovation. I think what we can do is to improve our technical innovation. So in last November, we announced the $110 billion investment for the new technology, for the new environmental technology, and also for new renewable energy technology. So we are going to be work very hard on these issues at the moment.
Thank you. So I want to turn for our first question, comment from the audience to the person who actually led us off, Ian, who gave the overview at the beginning. And if you have a question or comment for this panel, please. We do have a microphone, and where's it coming from? There. So if you could bring it here to Mr. Yes.
Thank you very much. I mean, firstly, just a brief comment since the last 2 points on gas. I think this is quite an important fact for the audience that cheap gas in America, even if it could come to Europe, isn't going to save the world. And there's a very important fact that underpins that. It costs $4 a barrel to move oil from anywhere in the world to anywhere else. And it costs $45 a barrel to move the same amount of energy as natural gas from one side of the world to the other, which means that actually what markets need to find is near market gas, ideally by pipeline, and that's a big challenge. Now my question is to the panel, I outlined a view that we need to have an overarching energy philosophy that will guide us over multiple decades, and Jean-Pierre underscored that desire, and the real question is, have we learned enough to do that? And if we have, is a bloc of 28 independent countries capable of coming up with such a thing?
You want to direct that at anyone in particular, Ian, or leave it to the panel?
Well, I think Jean-Pierre and Norbert, I'd ask them to maybe comment on that.
Good. Norbert?
Yes, we have to deliver on this point, and I think we agree very much on it. We have an internal European market, but we do not have a market for energy. And creating this market in Europe would contribute this strength, which we in general share and have as a European common market. So creating this market by regulation, by political decision, would make Europe much more stronger. And this would include, of course, the infrastructure for energy.
I'm an optimistic person, so I will say yes, I think it's possible, but it requires much more leadership coming from the EU, and it requires for member states to agree to let the EU set guidelines. I think there are areas where it's probably not that difficult. It's about renewables and how we can create mechanisms which allow us to increase our exposure to renewables. Where I think it's probably a bit more touchy is about nuclear. I think there we have issues which are very complex in some countries, and I think that the role of nuclear is probably a subject on which there is no European consensus today.
Perhaps one remark. Energy policy has for long been a matter of security policy. We argued in this way, but now we are making the experience. And I think experience is able to change politics.
Let me call on a representative of one of the world's leading energy producers, Russia, Ambassador Chezov.
Thank you very much. My question would be not on nuclear, not on Asia, but on the situation in Europe against the backdrop of the Ukrainian crisis. I've heard here from the panelists and elsewhere, I would say rosy pictures painted how Ukraine would be able to shift from using Russian gas to reverse flows, be it from Slovakia, be it from other countries. I believe that technologically that is possible. I wouldn't argue against that. But in order to bring gas from somewhere, you need to have that gas somewhere. As far as I know, Slovakia is not a major producer of natural gas.
No.
So if Slovakia undertakes to resell Russian gas to Ukraine, it would be perfectly okay with me. I would regard Slovakia as a much more reliable partner for Gazprom than Ukraine currently is. Then the next question ensuing, of course, who is going to pay for it? I fully share the view of experts regarding the figures of how much it costs to transport oil and gas from one place to another. So if there is a possibility to make that strange rerouting of gas becoming cheaper than gas directly supplied to Ukraine? Well, that may be possible, but it's not that easy to imagine. So my question is, all these projections, are they economically supported by calculations?
Carlos, I think that's probably directed at you. Who owns the gas and who's going to pay for it?
Ambassador Chezov, I'm very, very glad you made that comment. It's an excellent comment, and I hope that your comment is an indication of Russia's policy, because the implication is that Russia would be committed to continue to supply gas to its neighbor and to supply gas to Europe, and that you would do it at a reasonable price. And indeed, yesterday, Russia indicated that it will increase the price for Ukraine from $268 per 1,000 cubic meters to $478 on April 8th, with the expiration of the deal negotiated with Viktor Yanukovych, and that it will eliminate the $100 discount which was previously provided for the Black Sea Fleet, because you now have proposed to make, or your country has proposed to the international community that Crimea is now a part of the Russian Federation. That would put Ukraine receiving a price of gas higher than any other European country at rates that are clearly not market-determined rates. So I think, first of all, the issue here is exactly as you stated, that Russian gas is an important stabilizer in the market. It can create good competition. It could be a force for economic good. And I hope that Russia will actually act on that, ensure that it will continue to supply gas, and that it will do it at market rates. What we've also seen is that competition's a good thing. And so when in Europe there was the advent of LNG in 2011 and 2012, and it created an environment that allowed competition with Russian gas, where there was a lot of Norwegian gas coming into the market. That created a good competitive environment which allowed renegotiation of contracts with Gazprom. So I think your point is absolutely correct. Gas coming backwards from Poland, Hungary, Slovakia is not going to fix the issue in Ukraine. What it does is it creates an environment for competition. Last thing I would just say on this is that, and this is indicative of the new gas world in which we live in, the gas that is potentially purchased by Ukraine is not gas from Slovakia. It could be gas from Norway. It could be gas from Trinidad and Tobago, which is delivered at LNG ports in different parts of Europe. But now what Europe has is the ability to trade and swap and move gas in ways that didn't exist before. So it creates possibilities for openness and competition that we just didn't simply have in the past.
So I want to collect three comments here, since we're slowly running out of time, quickly running out of time. First, I want to call on the chairman of our board of the German Marshall Fund, Robin West, who's also one of the world's leading energy consultants, and then the gentleman there, and then Heather, yes, back here. Robin.
Yeah, one subject hasn't brought up at all has been all the southern core gas coming from the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean. That is proximate gas. It could compete with Russian gas. The Russians have done everything in their power to stop the development of those projects. And by the same token, the Europeans, as far as I can make out, have bungled this opportunity. They've refused to get organized. They've refused to move that gas. Will they start doing that now?
And yes, the microphone is making its way. Yes.
Thank you. Nelson Cunningham from Clardy Associates in Washington. My question is for Ambassador Pascual, who, in addition to having been ambassador to Mexico, was also ambassador to Ukraine, which gives him a unique competence at dealing with this current issue. You mentioned, Ambassador, that the U.S. has recently awarded 6 export permits for LNG. It's my understanding that there are 28 additional permits awaiting approval by the Department of Energy. The way that DOE has handled these in the past is it's waited strictly in queue, it's waited 3 or 4 months between each approval, and then it's approved the next one. My question for you is, and a number of members of Congress have called on the U.S., why don't we accelerate that pace? If there are 28 permits waiting, if we accelerate that pace of permitting, accelerate the pace of exports, don't we improve the competitive situation that you were just referencing a minute ago?
And yes, please, if there's a microphone here for, yes.
Thank you, Heather Graby from Open Society Foundations. I have a question for Norbert Röttgen above all, and indeed for the Europeans who read with great interest on Friday the European Council conclusions that called for much more radical and quicker steps towards energy independence in Europe, and particularly cutting off the isolation of, for example, Hungary, Slovakia and Bulgaria. But that could take a very, very long time, and we need very quick results. How about this idea? Why doesn't the EU start to treat energy, external energy supply, like trade, and simply appoint a single negotiator to negotiate on behalf of all of the 28 member states, get one price for all the member states, and essentially have a mandate from all of them at the level of the Commission?
Monopsony, one might call it. So let's take one more question here, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thanks. I'm Matt Bryza from the International Center for Defense Studies in Tallinn. In the spirit of Heather's question about getting Europe more organized, better organized on these issues, what are the mechanisms should worse come to worse? And the sanctions that are considered, or the response by Russia, is that the gas flows stop from Russia to the EU. And picking up on Ambassador Pascual's point, the reality, of course, and dear Mr. Ambassador, is that Russia is a lot more dependent, or is highly dependent on those revenues, at least as dependent on those revenues, as is Europe on the gas flows. So is there a way for Europe to develop a mechanism to share the risk and share the pain and make sure companies like Bulgaria that are 100% dependent on Russian gas, or Estonia, or Latvia, or Lithuania, make it through the storm? Thank you.
So let's go back to our panel. Please select among those what interests you most. Jean-Pierre, why don't we start with you?
No, just on the last two questions, I think better coordination in negotiating gas supply for Europe is certainly a way to go. Now we are very, very far from a situation where one single negotiator would be negotiating on behalf of probably the 10 or 15 companies, because today it's a business-to-business type of negotiation. But yes, I do believe that better coordination makes sense, and we see that in today's world, energy, as you were rightly saying at the beginning of this session, energy is a political tool.
But you'd feel comfortable with one monopsony buyer on behalf of these leading purchasers of...
No, I don't feel confident. I just think that we are not in a situation, especially in Europe, where we can just let market forces deal with these types of negotiation. I think there needs to be a political will to make sure that we try to make the best out of a very challenging situation as far as Europe gas supply is concerned.
Mr. Kihara.
Yeah, I just have an interest in the question about the shale gas LNG export. Recently, United States authorized the export to Japan involving the Japanese company, and now we have the full project on the table, and it's really helpful to diversify our resource, energy resources, and I'm quite sure that it will help the whole world. So I'm quite agree with him. It might be very helpful if you can accelerate the approval process.
Carlos, and I hope you will speak to this question of the southern sources of gas and how they fit into the picture of the question that Rob and West raised.
You didn't want me to say that, yes, the United States is going to accelerate the process. And
we want to know. Yeah, we want to know.
My boss sure would prefer I didn't. But I mean, Nelson, it's what he lays out is a very good question here, and he knows that I can't answer the question, but it's an issue. It's under the direct responsibility of the Department of Energy. But there are a couple of things that I just briefly want to note on it. since May of last year, there have been 5 licenses that have been approved. The whole process has been accelerated quite extensively. There is constantly a look at how it could be handled expeditiously within the constraints of the legislation that we have today. There's a great awareness on the part of the senior leadership in the United States that deals with energy policy on the interest in having more exports be able to go to market. One of the reasons why it becomes a complicated policy is exactly the reason that Jean-Paul said, that so many companies are going to the United States, but within the United States it has an impact on competitiveness, on petrochemicals, on steel, on cement, and those issues have to be addressed as well. But I think that the critical issue is that the United States has sent a very, very clear signal with the licenses that we have approved that we are going to be a player in global markets in LNG, and that this is going to facilitate trade. On the Southern Corridor issues, there are both huge possibilities and real progress that are being made. One piece of that progress, Ian knows very well because BP is one of the principal players. It's the Shah Deniz 2 project in Azerbaijan. They recently came to a final investment decision. There is a whole pipeline stream that connects Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, leading into Greece, Albania, and Italy. Marta Dessou was here, but I saw her walk out. She was a great champion of this when she was in the Italian government. That project is certainly going ahead full steam. There are a number of things that still need to be worked through, but it is one of the few projects that actually would bring new supplies of gas onto the European market, not just redivert the way that current gas is flowing into the European market. There are other Black Sea possibilities. Romania and Bulgaria have quite significant possibilities in both oil and gas. There are international companies involved in the development of those resources. I think one of the key things that still remains on the table today is for all of us to work very, very actively with the countries that are involved to ensure that the regulatory obstacles, the problems, and the constraints are moved away as quickly as possible, and that gas and that oil that is possible to develop there is, Robin, as you suggest, getting to markets, contributing to a competitive environment, contributing to energy security as quickly as it can get there.
Norbert, close us out, please.
If Ukraine will come under supply pressure by Russia, I think there are some short-term but costly measures we will take. And I'm convinced we will share the burden. And by this crisis will contribute to forge a European unity in energy policy and in foreign policy. This is one effect of this crisis. And secondly, I'm convinced that the experience of energy supply as a fundamental issue of security, and even the Ukraine security problem is perceived as a European, and by this, for example, a German problem, will contribute to accelerate a competitive environment for our energy policy with regard to creating a common market, investment in infrastructure, and evolving energy as a trade good in order to trigger the benefits of competition. I think we will accelerate to adjust under the experience we are facing now.
Thank you, panel. Clear, direct, helpful. Thank you very much.